The first sound was not an explosion, but a deep, metallic groan that traveled for miles through the ocean's depths. It was the sound of a leviathan in its death throes. On the surface, the Soviet ballistic missile submarine K-219 broke the water, not with purpose, but in a violent, uncontrolled ascent. Thick, black smoke, tinged with the toxic yellow of burning rocket fuel, poured from her shattered sail. The air crackled with frantic, panicked Russian voices screaming over the radio about a fire in a missile tube, a potential reactor breach. 1,000 yards away, the USS Viperfish hung motionless in the deep, a phantom in the dark. In the submarine's red-lit control room, the only sounds were the quiet beeps of sonar and the shallow breathing of her crew. Commander Robert Hayes stood with his eyes pressed to the periscope, his body rigid. He watched the tiny orange figures of Soviet sailors scrambling on the deck of their dying vessel. He stepped back from the eyepiece, his face a mask of cold granite. But every man in the control room could see the pulse hammering in his neck. A young sonar operator, Petty Officer Evans, had tears in his eyes, his head cocked to his headphones, listening to the sounds of the other sub's agony. Then, a new sound cut through the chaos. A dedicated printer, reserved for messages with a classification beyond top secret, word to life. The paper it produced was plain, the text stark. The XO, a seasoned officer named Miller, ripped it off and read it. The blood drained from his face. He handed it to Hayes. Hayes's eyes scanned the words. For a terrifying second, the mask of command shattered. A raw, unchecked horror flashed in his eyes. He crushed the paper in his fist. He keyed the ship-wide intercom. His voice, when it came, was low and ragged, stripped bare. "All hands, this is the captain. The K-219 is carrying a cipher machine called KRONOS. Our orders are to take it." A stunned silence choked the control room. Men exchanged disbelieving looks. They were submariners, not grave robbers. Hayes continued, his voice gaining a sharp, brutal edge. "A Soviet salvage tug, the Kolomia, will be here in 5 hours. Our window is 4. We will launch the ROVs, penetrate the wreck, and extract the device. There is zero margin for error." He paused, letting the impossible scale of the task sink in. If we are seen, if we are detected, if we leave a single tool behind, the Soviets will not see an intelligence operation. They will see an American attack submarine finishing off their crippled boat. They will see an act of war. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his terrified crew. They will retaliate. They have every right to. Our success, our silence, is the only thread holding back a nuclear response. The lives of everyone on this boat, and millions of people on the surface, now depend on our absolute, perfect stealth. We are no longer observers. We are the tip of the spear, poised at the heart of Armageddon. He turned to his XO, Miller, whose face was a sheet of white. "God, Robert," Miller whispered. Hayes's eyes were devoid of any comfort. "He can't help us here. It's just us now." Hayes moved aft, into the specialized compartment, where the 2 sapient ROVs were housed. Lieutenant Anna Kozlov, the lead pilot, was already there. Her hands moved with a surgeon's precision over the controls, but they were trembling. She was of Russian descent. The voices screaming on the radio were the voices of her parents' homeland, the language of her childhood. She looked up at Hayes, her eyes a turbulent mix of determination, fear, and a deep, personal shame. "They're dying up there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Hayes placed a hand on the cold, sleek hull of the nearest ROV, a gesture both commanding and funereal. I know. And we are going to use their tragedy as our perfect cover. You have 4 hours, Lieutenant. Go into that tomb and bring me back their greatest secret. The control room of the Viperfish had become a tomb of focused silence. Every non-essential system was powered down. The air grew stale and warm, thick with the smell of nervous sweat and ozone. The only light came from the ghostly green glow of the sonar screens and the tactical displays. Commander Hayes stood behind the 2 ROV pilot stations, a statue of imposed calm, his presence a constant, heavy weight. Lieutenant Anna Kozlov and her co-pilot, Chief Dyson, were sealed in their own world. Their faces were illuminated by the screens displaying the feeds from the external cameras. They guided the 2 sapient ROVs, now designated Scalpel 1 and Scalpel 2, through the pitch-black water. The only sound from their station was the soft, precise click of joysticks and the occasional hushed command. On the main screen, the wreck of the K-219 slowly materialized from the abyssal darkness. It was a terrifying sight. The massive submarine lay canted on its side on the ocean floor, a great leviathan brought low. A jagged, horrific tear ran along the missile compartment, a wound that had vomited death into the sea. Streams of bubbles, the boat's last breaths, still rose from the wreckage. Approaching the primary entry point, the torpedo loading hatch, Kozlov's voice was a tight, controlled monotone. The ROVs, their lights cutting stark beams through the void, looked like mechanical insects crawling on a carcass. Using their powerful manipulator arms, they began the delicate work of burning through the hardened steel bolts of the hatch. The process was agonizingly slow. Each burst of the laser cutter sent a shower of molten metal sparkling into the darkness, a firework display in a graveyard. Inside the Viperfish, the sonar chief, Petty Officer Evans, had his eyes screwed shut. His entire being focused on his headphones. He was listening to the sounds of the dying boat, the metallic groans and pings of the cooling hull, and then something else. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It was not the random noise of a collapsing structure. It was deliberate, a pattern. "Captain," Evans said, his voice cracking, "I'm picking up impacts from inside the hull. Forward compartment." A cold dread swept through the control room. They all knew what it meant. They were not alone down here. Hayes's voice was dangerously calm. "Clarify, sonar." It's Morse code, sir. Faint. It's SOS. And Nai Brosite." Kozlov, who had been focused on her screen, froze. She didn't need a translation. "Nebrosite. Don't leave us." There were survivors, trapped in an airtight pocket, waiting for a rescue that would never come, while an American robot cut into their tomb. Her hands trembled on the controls. The laser, off by a millimeter, scarred the hull near the hatch. A collective gasp went through the room. "Lieutenant!" Hayes's voice cut through her panic like a whip. "Focus on your mission." His words were not cruel, but they were absolute. The mission was all that stood between them and hell. The lives of a few doomed Soviet sailors could not be weighed against the lives of millions. Kozlov took a shuddering breath, her knuckles white. She nodded, her jaw clenched. She guided the laser back on target, sealing the fate of the men tapping in the dark with every precise, brutal cut. The final bolt gave way. With a powerful shove from Scalpel 2's manipulators, the heavy hatch swung inward, revealing a black maw. The ROVs, like surgical probes, slid inside the corpse of the K-219, their lights piercing a darkness that had not been broken for 1,000 years. They were in. They had crossed the threshold. But the sound of those desperate fading taps followed them into the belly of the beast, a ghostly conscience in the crushing deep. The interior of the K-219 was a nightmare landscape of twisted metal, dangling wires, and floating debris. The ROV's lights cut swaths through the murky water, illuminating overturned chairs, scattered documents, and the personal effects of the crew. A photograph of a family, a waterlogged book. Every shadow looked like a body. Kozlov navigated the labyrinthine corridors from memory, using schematics studied for countless hours. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whir of the ROV's thrusters. The Morse code tapping had stopped. That silence was worse. "Approaching the communications room," she announced, her voice hollow. The door was jammed shut, bent in its frame from the force of the explosion. Scalpel 1 extended its cutting laser, the intense beam sizzling as it bit into the steel. The process felt obscenely loud, a violation of the submarine's tomb. Inside the viperfish, no one spoke. They just watched the screens, witnessing the desecration. The door gave way with a groan that echoed through the hydrophones. The ROVs pushed inside, and there it was. Bolted to a shock-absorbent base, surrounded by dead control panels, was the KRONOS cipher machine. It was larger than they had anticipated, a formidable block of dark metal and rows of complex rotors, its face a grid of Cyrillic letters. "Target acquired," Dyson said, a note of grim triumph in his voice. The extraction was the most delicate part. Scalpel 1 used its manipulators to unscrew the mounting bolts, while Scalpel 2 positioned a specialized harness around the heavy device. One wrong move could damage the priceless machinery. The clock was ticking down. The Soviet salvage tug was getting closer. Its propeller noise was a constant, growing drumbeat in the background. The final bolt came free. With immense care, the two ROVs lifted the KRONOS device from its housing. For a moment, it floated, suspended in the dark water, a technological heart, ripped from a dead body. "Package is secure. Beginning exfiltration," Kozlov reported. As Scalpel 2 began backing out of the communications room, its camera panned across a corner. Something moved. A boot. Then another. The light caught a face, pale and bloated, eyes wide open, staring directly into the camera. It was a Soviet sailor, his body wedged between two consoles, preserved in the cold and the pressure. He seemed to be guarding his post, even in death. Kozlov let out a sharp, involuntary gasp and looked away from the screen. Hayes, watching over her shoulder, did not flinch. His eyes were fixed on the KRONOS device. "Bring it home, Lieutenant," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. The ROVs, carrying their terrible prize, retraced their path through the corpse of the submarine, past the ghost of the sailor, and out into the open water, leaving the silence of the grave behind them. The metallic clunk of the ROV docking into its cradle was the most beautiful sound Commander Hayes had ever heard. For a fleeting second, a wave of pure, unadulterated triumph washed over him. They had done it. Against all odds, they had stolen a secret from the heart of a Soviet fortress. That second died a sudden, violent death. "New contact! High-speed screws. Bearing 190, closing fast." Petty Officer Evans's voice was a razor-sharp scream of terror that tore through the control room. "It's the Kolomia. She's launching something. Small, active pinging. It's a submersible." The world inside the viperfish snapped from quiet triumph to frantic survival. The red battle lights seemed to burn brighter, harsher. On the sonar screen, a new, menacing blip separated from the Soviet salvage tug. It was a small, agile Russian submersible, a prize-class deep-dive vehicle. Its active sonar began pinging the water, a loud, intrusive click, click, click that echoed through the hull of the viperfish, like knuckles rapping on a coffin lid. "They're hunting," the XO whispered, his face ashen. Hayes's mind became a cold, calculating machine. "All stop. Kill all active systems. Rig for ultra-silent running. Make us a hole in the ocean." The viperfish went dead. Every pump, every fan, every piece of non-essential machinery was shut down. The crew held their breath, moving in slow, deliberate motions. The temperature began to spike immediately. They were playing dead. The Russian submersible was methodical, sweeping the area like a bloodhound. Its pings grew louder, more insistent. It was circling the wreck of the K-219, and then it began to expand its search pattern, directly towards them. On the main display, the blip representing the Russian vehicle and the one representing their own boat were on a converging course. "They found something," Evans reported, his voice trembling. "They're zeroing in on the chemical trail from the ROV's thrusters. They're following our scent." Hayes watched the screen, his options evaporating. They couldn't run without making noise. They couldn't fight without starting a war. They were trapped. The pinging became deafening, a relentless, metallic hammering against their hull. The Russian submersible was right on top of them. Through the external hydrophones, they could hear the whine of its electric motors, the sound of its manipulator arms adjusting. It was hovering directly overhead. A young helmsman closed his eyes, his lips moving in silent prayer. Hayes looked at the XO. "They're going to try and identify us. If they get a camera on our hull markings, it's over." He made a decision. A desperate, insane gamble. "Chief Miller," Hayes said, his voice lethally calm. "Deploy the acoustic countermeasure launcher. Program a single noisemaker. Set it to mimic a blue whale's vocalization. Launch it 1,000 yards off our port bow, depth 200 feet. It was a bluff of astronomical proportions. A dull thump echoed through the ship as the canister was launched. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, a low, mournful, booming call filled the ocean. The deep, complex song of a blue whale, the loudest animal on the planet, erupted from the noisemaker. On the sonar, the Russian submersible stopped. Its pinging ceased. They could almost picture the confusion in its cockpit. A whale. It was just a whale. The submersible lingered for another eternal minute, its sonar now passive, listening. Then, with a final skeptical whine of its motors, it turned away. Slowly, it began its journey back towards the Kolomia and the wreck it was meant to guard. The control room remained in total silence for a full minute after the Russian vehicle had disappeared from the scopes. Hayes finally allowed himself to breathe. "Helm, ahead slow. Make your depth 600. Set a course for home." As the viperfish began to creep away, Hayes looked at the secured container holding the KRONOS device. It no longer felt like a trophy. It felt like a live bomb that had, by some miracle, failed to detonate. They had escaped the hunter, but the shadow of the bear they had just poked now stretched across the entire Atlantic, and it was a very, very angry shadow. The return journey was a funeral procession in the dark. The triumph that should have filled the USS Viperfish was instead a heavy, suffocating absence. The crew moved like ghosts, their faces hollow, their eyes avoiding each other. They had done the impossible, but the cost was a stain on their souls that no seawater could wash clean. Inside the small, sealed cryptographic room, the KRONOS device sat on a bench, its cold, Soviet engineering looking utterly alien. Two technicians, supervised by a stone-faced man from the NSA who had flown out to a rendezvous point, were already dissecting it. They spoke in hushed, clinical tones, marveling at the circuitry, the rotors, the genius of their enemy. To them it was a puzzle box. To the crew it was a piece of a tomb. Commander Hayes stood in his cabin, staring at his reflection in the dark glass of a porthole. He saw the face of a man who had won. He saw the face of a man who had ordered his people to ignore the dying taps of fellow sailors. He saw the face of a man who had gambled the fate of the world on the song of a fake whale. The faces merged into one, and he did not recognize it. He thought of Anna Kozlov. She had not left her bunk since being relieved. When he had passed her in the corridor, her eyes, once fierce and determined, were empty. She had looked right through him, as if he were the ghost. Days later, the viperfish slipped into its home port under the cover of a thick, pre-dawn fog. There were no cheering crowds, no bands. The debriefing was held in a sterile, windowless conference room at the naval base. Admirals and men in crisp civilian suits shook their hands. They were called heroes, patriots, the finest America had to offer. They were told the intelligence from KRONOS would save countless lives, would tilt the balance of the Cold War for years to come. Hayes sat through it, nodding at the right times, saying the right words. He felt like he was watching a play about someone else. The praise was ash in his mouth. That night, alone in his quarters on base, he poured a drink, but did not drink it. He opened a classified after-action report that had just crossed his desk. It contained intercepted Soviet communications. The official announcement: the K-219 was lost with all hands. A tragic accident. A memorial service would be held in Sevastopol. But buried deeper was a fragment of a signal from the Kolomea. A single confused line from the captain of the Russian submersible. He reported an anomalous acoustic event near the wreck site. A whale song where no whales were known to migrate. He strongly recommended a more thorough investigation of the K-219's wreckage, citing possible foreign interference. The recommendation was officially dismissed as the paranoid ramblings of a grief-stricken commander. Hayes put the report down. They had gotten away with it. They were safe. The world was safe. He walked to the window and looked out at the calm, dark water of the harbor. Somewhere, in a small apartment, Anna Kozlov was trying to sleep. Somewhere in the Soviet Union, families were mourning their sons, husbands, and fathers. And somewhere at the bottom of the Atlantic, the K-219 sat in the eternal silence, a metal coffin they had picked clean. He had his victory. It was everything they had said it was. A masterpiece of espionage. A legendary operation. He picked up the glass and finally took a sip. The whiskey tasted of nothing at all. He had returned from the deep with the greatest prize of his career, but he had left his humanity down there in the crushing dark, next to the men he had been ordered to abandon. The silence they had maintained was no longer a tactical necessity. It had become a part of them, a permanent, internal void from which no echo would ever return.